Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize for coming a little bit late this morning. The first thing I always have to do at any event is always to make a correction that I am actually Minister of Industry, Trade and Investment, not trade and investment only. Otherwise, people in the industrial sector will be unhappy with me, so I have to make sure that I correct that very quickly. Let me first say that I'm glad to address this gathering today on a very important topic to the economic development of Nigeria, and an issue critical to the lives of billions of people living in emerging markets. The issue of trade facilitation and trade policy are indeed fundamental to the domestic real sector and provide access and channels to the new foreign markets. In fact, I think the consensus among policymakers all over the world today is that under the current economic climate we live in the world, the tools for sustainable and inclusive economic growth today is trade and investment. That is recognized generally by policymakers across the world. I commend the Financial Times for once again being exemplary by leading the charge on an innovative discourse such as this one. For over 130 years, the Financial Times has served as one of the world's leading shapers of global thinking on matters of global finance, economics, and politics. The Financial Times have seen the world emerge into what we have today, and there are very, very few organizations with the weight of institutional memory and experience as the Financial Times. I once again commend them for their effort and wish them many more centuries ahead on global financial markets. I also want to commend the Nigerian Customs Services, in particular the head of that service, the general, say that again? Controller General. I wanted to make sure I got that right. But I don't refer to him anymore as Controller General, CG. I refer to him as my friend. So but for the leadership he has given the customs over the years. The customs services are partnering with the FTA on this, and as I always say, the customs services has three main functions. One is revenue generation, the second is security, the third is trade facilitation. But I think today it is recognized that trade facilitation is actually the bedrock, the platform for customs to play a major role in the economic transformation of any country, and in particular in any of the emerging markets. Ladies and gentlemen, trade is the blood of the modern global economy. It integrates the fates of the world's 7 billion people. In 13 years, that will be 8 billion. And the destinies of all 196 nations in the globe. Today, the world does about 18 trillion of global trade in merchandise goods and another $4.3 trillion of trade in commercial services. About 1/3 of the global economy is driven by international trade today. This shows the importance of trade to jobs, the importance of trade to poverty alleviation, economic development, and wealth creation. The world has never been as integrated as it is today. In fact, it's described as a global village. In terms of trade and in terms of issues. As many countries situate their products and their services along the supply or the value chain of most products. Over the last 10 years, growth in the global trade has been faster than growth in GDP, with global trade growing at 3.5% and GDP growing at about 2.5%. Trade has therefore had a net benefit global growth, opening up new markets for producers and strengthening the economic complementarities between nations. For developed nations, trade has kept inflation low, thereby reducing the cost of living, boosting savings, and ultimately investments in new industries. For emerging markets, trade has boosted employment. It has provided the avenue for people to trade out of poverty, and it has attracted new types of players, new types of investors, as companies expand to reach new markets and fully integrate into the global economy. So in a nutshell, trade as a philosophy, trade as an idea, is a good thing for the world. However, some fault lines currently exist in global trade. At the moment, global trade is still too concentrated on a few large economies. Only 10 countries currently account for about 51% of the world's merchandise trade. In addition, about 28% of the world trade is brokered within regional trade agreements, such as NAFTA, the EU, Mercosur, and others. Efforts by the World Trade Organization to develop truly multilateral trade agreement took 13 years, but at least we got there. And I was privileged to be part of that agreement that was struck in Bali. I was privileged to be the chairman of the MC8, the Global Trade Ministers in Geneva, and I played a major role in Bali in securing that agreement. No country got what it wanted, but we all left Bali with something. It was history for the world, history for the WTO, who needed it, and it was important for all the nations because it became a win-win situation for all of us. For African countries, which I am naturally concerned about, our continent is almost completely shut out of global trade. At the moment, Africa accounts for only 3% of the global trade, despite the large exports of commodities from our continent. A big reason for this is Africa's emphasis on low-value primary goods and raw materials, which are priced low on international markets. There's a strong correlation between that low number of 3% with Africa's contribution to the manufacturing value addition, which is roughly less than 1% today. And as you all know, history tells us, and this is my most favorite quote, history tells us that no nation has managed to move from a poor to a rich nation by relying entirely on exporting raw materials without a strong industrial and services sector. The more you specialize in trading in raw materials, the poorer you become as a nation. And that is the path Africa, the path Nigeria must tread going forward. Furthermore, over the past decades, between 10% and 12% of Africa's total trade has been with fellow African nations, according to official figures. Because I know that the trade between African countries, in particular West African countries, a lot of that is informal. But when you take the formal trade, it's between 10 to 12%. And this is low compared to the rest of the world. The focus by African countries to look outwards rather than within the continent for trading partners and not to prioritize investment in adding value to the commodities we have is indeed lost opportunity to facilitate and accelerate regional economic development and to improve the quality of our global trade. Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to say that this is changing now as we build a new Africa, a new Nigeria for the world. These are interesting times for us Africans. Africa today has never been where it is today, anywhere in the history of Africa. And our continent is beginning to build the synergies across economies and to survive in the increasingly fiercely competitive global environment. To move forward, Africa has started rethinking its approach to trade. In Nigeria, we have begun that process already. Nigeria is currently repositioning its trade strategies to cope with emerging global trends. The overarching trade strategy developed by the Nigerian government has a key for a number of institutions, including the Nigerian Customs Services in particular. And I will briefly mention just three specific themes of our new approach to trade. Firstly, our new policy emphasizes the actions to boost domestic, regional, and international trade. More importantly, Nigeria is taking the position that even as we seek to do more trade with the world, we cannot and we must not threaten economic integration with our fellow African countries. In fact, they are our priority. And the reason is clear, or the reasons are clear. As Mansour said earlier on from Dangote Group, yes, we recognize Africa today as the last frontier, but we have more than being the last frontier. It's a continent today that in total has about 1 billion people, a combined GDP of about 2 trillion people, a continent that contributed 6 of the 10 fastest economies between 2021 and 2010, a continent that will account for 7 of the 10 fastest economies between 2010 and 2015, according to IMF. 17 African countries today are ahead of India on World Bank ease of doing business. 35 African countries are ahead of Russia on Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. And according to the World Bank, among 50 economies with the biggest improvement since 2005, the largest share, 1/3 of that, are in Africa. And today, Africa has one of the fastest growing middle class and consumer group in the world today. All of these, if we look at the top 10 countries that we have the youngest population going forward, Africa will have 10 of those fastest, youngest growing population, which is a market, a consumer market for everyone. Japan will head the list of the oldest countries in the world, with about 23% of its population over 65 years old, followed very closely by countries like Germany, Italy, and other European countries. China is also aging fast and declining in terms of population. So the future of the world's young population is in developing countries. It is in Africa, and it is in Nigeria. That is why we must focus on that going forward. The other point which I want to make is that when you look at it, these sectorial reforms in Nigeria, therefore, form the basis for the tariffs we set. The contents of our bilateral agreements, and of course, our partnerships going forward. As investors expand and reach out to new markets. Secondly, Africa is more strategic over the long run than our integration with EU or the Americas or Asia, even though our largest import comes from Asia today, from China. Today, 60% of the trade of Europe is between European countries, and about 33% of United States' total trade is with its neighbors in NAFTA. Strong regional trade is therefore not a fad. It is essential to build, scale, and deepen production capacity to compete in today's new global economy. Nigeria will therefore push for higher levels of intra-Africa trade and will work to ensure African economies, or the economic bloc within Africa, remain strong, relevant, and modernized to meet the needs of our people. And for Nigeria, the domestic trade is very, very important to us. And the reasons are clear also why we must focus on our domestic trade as we focus on the regional trade. Because we have what most countries do not have. We have the commodities, the raw materials in abundance in the country. But on trade, what is also significant in trade is having the market, the consumer market. Today, Nigeria, yes, 170 million people, growing at 3% per annum. It's a country that by 2070 will become the third largest nation in the world after India and China. And that tells you the direction of where that market is going. It's a country where 1 in every 4, 1 in every 5 African you see anywhere in the world is a Nigerian. It's a country where the median age is only about 18 years old. It's a country that has a consumer market of roughly about 400 billion, and that is set to increase to about 1.4 trillion by 2030. That is why everyone wants to be in Nigeria, regardless of our challenges. We do have our challenges, we recognize them, but there is money to be made in that country and in that continent. That is why our domestic policy is critical. But in order to optimize and benefit from a regional and domestic trade strategy, Nigeria must take and has taken firm position to invest in infrastructure. You heard from the Dangote Group about the importance of power, the importance of infrastructure, railroads. We have to invest in all those sectors and have to be creative in how we invest in them. Therefore, must invest in infrastructure, in technology, and in processes. And to have one of the most competitive cross-border trading operations in the world. That is our second priority. In this regard, I must say that Nigeria is fully committed to implementing the trade facilitation agreement we all agreed in Bali. This is where the Nigerian Customs Services is most essential, and where already they are already taking the lead. And for this, I must commend the CJ and his senior management and staff for their innovative thinking, their investment in many areas to facilitate trade and to recognize that their job today is more about trade facilitation, not about revenue. Revenue will come. When I was Minister of Finance and they reported to me, I always said revenue was far more important because I was more interested in the money. Every time I met with the CJ in my office, I said, look, don't waste your time. All I need, what is the target? How far have you gone? This is where I expect you to be. I don't care how you make it. I want the money in. That is how Minister of Finance think and react and behave. When you sit on this side, you understand it maybe a little bit better. That money will come if you focus more on trade facilitation. Our country, as I said, has over 170 million people, growing at 3% per annum. Therefore, Nigeria's trade needs are one of the highest in the world. In 2013, total cargo throughput, excluding crude oil cargo, at all Nigerian ports was about 76 million metric tons, which is by far the busiest operations in Africa. And as demand grows, the Nigerian government is repositioned the Nigerian customs to meet these challenges. Critical to this agenda is the strategic use of technology, such as a new trade hub, which has been developed primarily by the customs services and the single window platform to automate customs operations. Expansion of infrastructure by expanding existing ports and building new ones. And a complete regulatory overhaul by reducing the number of the government agencies and operating on a 24/7 basis, and administrative procedures that add to the length of time and cost of trading across our borders. And lastly, I talked briefly on the needed integration between trade, between industry, and investment policies. Those three must come together, and that's why I made a point earlier to correct that it's Minister in charge of industry, trade, and investment. Those three are interlinked. You cannot be seen separately, and they work together, and the integration is critical to trade, to economic transformation and development of any country. Simply put, trade and industrialization cannot be separated. A nation's industrial agenda is what drives its trade and investment agenda. For decades, Nigeria did not align these policies, but this has been changed under the current government. Recently, our president, His Excellency Dr. Goodluck Ebele Jonathan, launched a number of transformational sectorial reforms to boost the real sector of our economy. For instance, the Nigerian Industrial Revolution Plan, which has now been adopted by UNIDO. That is why I leave this conference to go to Austria today, because I'll be giving a presentation on Industrial Revolution Plan to UNIDO and other ministers of industry across the world. Because UNIDO has adopted Nigeria and Ethiopia as the two countries they expect to see significant level of industrialization based on the Industrial Revolution Plan, which the President launched on the 11th of February this year. Now, he launched the Industrial Revolution Plan, which aims to boost manufacturing revenues by extra about $13 billion to $40 billion every year over the next 5 years. The Agricultural Transformation Agenda, which aims to increase food production by 20 million tons of food per year And we have to do that because the world is about 7 billion. In 13 years, will be about 8 billion. But it took us almost 100 years to move from 1 billion to 2 billion in terms of population of the world. To feed that level of people in the world, food production has to increase by roughly about 70% over the next 40 years. That is why food is so critical to the world today. And Nigeria is not left out in that plan. The president also launched a Nigerian Enterprise Development Program, which is providing the support structures to boost small businesses and generate jobs and many other programs. Let me share a few key elements of the Nigerian Industrial Revolution Plan. It is a plan that basically talks about adding value to our many commodities. A plan that is based on where Nigeria has competitive and comparative advantage, where Nigeria can be number one in Africa and a top 10 player globally, based on areas where we have competitive advantage. So for example, in agriculture, we have about 84 million hectares of land where almost everything can be grown. 40% of that is cultivated today, and therefore we can move from just the primary production to value addition, for example, from sugar cane to sugar, food processing, leather and leather products, palm oil production, cocoa production, and all that. We have a country that has about 44 different solid minerals in commercial quantity. Therefore, we can move from iron ore to flat sheets. We have moved from limestone to cement. And that, in that regard, I must commend the group led by Dangote, that group that has transformed the cement sector of the economy from a country that produced just roughly about 2 million metric tons of cement in 2002 to a country who, in 2013, that produced about 28.5 million metric tons and became a net exporter of cement. A country, that sector, because of government policies and investment going to that sector, by the end of this year, we should have the capacity to produce about 39 million metric tons and should have one of, if not the largest cement producing plant in the world in Nigeria. That is what we have done in the cement sector, from limestone